Hello, welcome to our next lesson on analogical arguments. Right now we'll be looking at the evaluation of such arguments. Evaluating analogical arguments is generally the same as evaluating other arguments. Use proper form and true premises tests. So just like other arguments, analogical arguments must pass both tests in order to be a good argument. However, there are some differences. Analogical arguments may use hypothetical or imaginary scenarios to draw an analogy. Remember the argument by analogy that your parents may have given that, well, you want to go to this party, you say everyone's going to be there. Well, just because everyone jumps off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? Sometimes hypothetical or imaginary scenarios can be one of the things that's being analogized, and that's perfectly fine with analogical arguments. Of course, it would be preferable if the situations were more realistic. However, you can use these kinds of fantastic hypothetical scenarios when making an argument by analogy. And that's okay. It doesn't necessarily mean that the argument is wrong. Let's look closely at this particular argument by analogy. Let's look at the first column. P1. Plants do not have high reasoning capacities, and they do not have the right to be free from being eaten by humans. Second premise. Many non-human animals do not have high reasoning capacities. Conclusion, therefore, many non-human animals do not have the right to be free from being eaten by humans. So this is an argument by analogy, analogizing plants with non-human animals. They both do not have high reasoning capacities, and since plants do not have the right to be free from being eaten by humans, the conclusion is that, therefore, non-human animals also do not have this right. Okay, so let's look at some analysis of this argument in the second column. We can first point out this, that infants and the severely mentally handicapped do not have high reasoning capacities, and they do have the right to be free from being eaten by humans. So in the argument, what's being used is the fact that if you don't have high reasoning capacities, then perhaps you can be eaten, right? And non-human animals don't have these capacities, and so therefore you can be eaten, just as you can say the same thing for plants. However, here's a counterexample. Infants and the severely mentally handicapped do not have high reasoning capacities, but that doesn't mean we can just go around eating other people's infants, babies, or go and eat the severely mentally handicapped. Right? We can't just go around doing that. So it looks like here that thus having high reasoning capacities is not a relevant similarity. So having high reasoning capacities is put forth in the premises as being a similarity between plants and non-human animals. But it's not relevant to the argument, because even if something, just because something does not have high reasoning capacities, it doesn't therefore follow that we can therefore eat it whenever we want to. Just look at infants and the severely mentally handicapped. So in other words, this similarity between plants and non-human animals is irrelevant for the argument. That's what the criticism here is. It's an irrelevant similarity. It's not going to do the proper work to generate the conclusion. So let's look at the next point. Plants cannot feel emotions like pain, but many non-human animals do feel emotions. Plants do not feel emotions, but non-human animals do feel emotions. Many of them do. And perhaps if something can feel pain and suffering, that itself provides a reason not to cause that thing pain and suffering. If a dog can feel pain and suffering, then that perhaps provides a reason that we shouldn't cause it pain and suffering by, let's say, kicking it just for fun. So what's being proposed here is that this is an important difference between the two, and it's a relevant dissimilarity. In other words, there's a dissimilarity between plants and non-human animals. Namely, non-human animals many of them can feel emotions, but plants do not. That's a dissimilarity, the capacity to feel emotions versus the capacity versus not having this capacity. And this dissimilarity is not merely a difference that makes no difference, but it is a difference that makes a difference. It is perhaps relevant in this case, because if something can feel emotions, then that itself provides reason not to cause pain and suffering to that thing. That looks like it supports, goes against the conclusion that non-human animals, in fact, do have the right to be free from being eaten by humans. So this is a dissimilarity that's relevant in the sense here, for this argument, that it's morally relevant for going against the conclusion that's stated in the original argument. Okay, so let's talk further about relevant similarities and relevant dissimilarities. A relevant similarity is a feature where the analog and the primary subject sharing that feature provides some evidence that the primary subject has the conclusory feature. So remember, when making an argument by analogy, the two things that are being analogized must be analogous in order to conclude that the conclusory feature is attributed to the primary subject. So the similarities are important, and it's important that the similarities that are needed to reach the conclusion are relevant similarities. If they're not relevant similarities, and perhaps there are no relevant similarities that have enough strength, then the conclusion does not follow. The conclusion is not adequately supported. So it's important that the similarities be relevant rather than irrelevant. What's a relevant dissimilarity? Well, that's a feature where the analog and the primary subject, not sharing that feature, provides some evidence that the primary subject does not have the conclusory feature. So a relevant dissimilarity is where you have the two things being analogized, the analog and the primary subject, but there's a dissimilarity. There's a feature that's a dissimilarity between the two, where one of them has it and the other one doesn't. And the fact that they don't share this feature provides evidence against the conclusion, that the conclusion doesn't follow. Someone making an objection based on a relevant dissimilarity might say, well, actually, in your argument by analogy, there's a dissimilarity between the two things being analogized, such that they're not analogous, and this dissimilarity is relevant to the argument, so therefore, the conclusion does not follow. Now, there can be dissimilarities that are irrelevant, and they will not have an effect on the conclusion, and perhaps the conclusion will still follow. Right? When analogizing two things, I'm sure you can come up with some kind of dissimilarity between the two things being analogized. For example, if you're analogizing a banana with an apple, there's one dissimilarity between the two in that they occupy different places in space. Right? That's a dissimilarity, but it may not be relevant, a relevant dissimilarity, such that it can be used as an objection against the argument by analogy. Let's move on to the next bullet point here. If someone can show either that the similarities cited in an analogy are not relevant, or that there are relevant dissimilarities between the analog and the primary subject, then the analogy doesn't do well on the proper form test. In other words, even if you assume that the premises are true, if the similarities are not relevant, or if there are relevant dissimilarities, then the conclusion is not sufficiently supported, even if you assume for the sake of argument that the premises are true. So these are some important ways you can, assess how well your argument by analogy is that you're making, as well as assessing other people's arguments by analogy. So how do we determine whether a similarity is relevant or irrelevant? Same with a dissimilarity. When is a dissimilarity relevant or irrelevant? Well, there are some things to take into consideration for this. Consider background knowledge and the conclusion of the argument, or the subject matter of the argument. For example, in the case about plants and non-human animals and whether or not it's morally permissible to eat them or not, well, we should take into account that the subject matter is one about ethics. And the conclusion is a conclusion about ethics, about whether or not it's permissible, right, to eat non-human animals or not. So we can bring in, therefore we should bring in, when relevant, background knowledge about ethics in order to see whether or not a similarity or dissimilarity is relevant or irrelevant. For example, we can bring in this background knowledge that the ability to feel pain and suffering may be a reason not to cause something to feel such emotions. That kind of background knowledge can be used to support the point that the fact that non-human animals can feel emotions but plants cannot is a relevant dissimilarity. It's a morally relevant dissimilarity, right? The subject matter at hand is one of ethics, so we should focus on features, or the lack thereof, that are relevant, morally relevant. Okay, so also to keep in mind, as with inductive arguments, the strength of an analogical argument comes in degrees. So an analogical argument is an inductive argument, so it comes in matters of degree, of likelihood. So the more evidence a relevant similarity provides, the stronger the analogy. So it depends upon the strength of the premises and the similarities stated in the premises that determines the strength of the conclusion. Right? If you have very strong premises in regards to the similarities, their relevance, etc., well then this can lead to a stronger argument by analogy, where the conclusion follows with greater likelihood. Okay, so let's look at some problems here. And here we are going to be interested in whether or not what's in bold is a relevant or irrelevant similarity. So in the first problem, we have this passage. We ran 2 studies where the subjects in both studies were female, between the ages of 20 to 30, weighed between 115 and 130 pounds, and came from middle-class backgrounds. Since the first group gave particular answers on a moral questionnaire about international relations, we should expect similar answers from the second group. So this argument by analogy provides several similarities between the 2 things being analogized, namely the 2 testing groups. And when we look at what's in bold, weighed between 115 and 130 pounds, this is what we should assess as whether or not it's relevant or an irrelevant similarity. To determine whether it's relevant or irrelevant, we should look at the subject matter at hand, look at the conclusion. The conclusion says we should expect similar answers from the second group. In other words, we should expect similar moral answers to the moral questionnaire from the second group as compared to the first group. Okay, so our issue is one about answering moral questions. So is weighing between 115 and 130 pounds relevant for thinking that people in the second group will provide similar answers to the first group in regards to moral questions about international relations? Is weight relevant here? This is an irrelevant similarity between both groups. It doesn't provide weight to believing that the conclusory feature applies to the primary subject in the conclusion. However, some of the other features can be relevant similarities. For example, being female. It could be the case that females generally tend to think a certain way on ethics as compared to males. It could also be the case that people of within a certain age group tend to think more alike in ethics as compared to other age groups. And it could be the case that people of the same socioeconomic background tend to hold the same moral beliefs as compared to people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So those can be relevant similarities and provide evidence for the conclusion. However, weighing between 115 to 130 pounds, that's irrelevant. Let's look at the next one. Harming an innocent stranger is like harming your little sister. So that's what they both have in common, that of harming. So these are hypothetical situations. If you wouldn't harm your little sister, in other words, if it's wrong to harm your little sister, then don't harm an innocent stranger. In other words, it's wrong to harm an innocent stranger. So is this similarity between the stranger and your little sister of hypothetically harming them, is harming relevant or an irrelevant similarity? Well, let's look at the conclusion. The conclusion here is that don't harm an innocent stranger. You shouldn't harm an innocent stranger. or it's morally wrong to harm an innocent stranger. So insofar as the conclusion is about the moral wrongness of harming, harming is itself a relevant similarity in this case, given what the conclusion and the subject matter is about. So harming is a relevant similarity in this instance. Okay, so that's all I have for you in this lesson, and I will see you for the next.